Hi, we continue in Acts 7 today as Stephen continues in his speech before the Sanhedrin to tell the story of Moses in 3 40-year increments. So if you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit of Acts 6 and 7, I go over these questions you see on the right side of the screen, and we've been following through these, especially now, the themes of Stephen's speech and the parallels between Stephen after his speech and the Passion of Jesus, and we've seen some of those along the way. And at the end, we'll look at the role of a young man named Saul, also known as Paul. As we look at the shape of our passage here, we can see that our chapter doesn't follow a chiastic overall shape, but a series of paragraphs based on the personage or the situation in Israel's history that Stephen's going through. So we looked at Abraham here and the key words in that section around earth or land and father. Then we saw Joseph and the question of Egypt, and we're still in Egypt. And what we see at the beginning of Joseph is the patriarchs, his brothers referred to curiously as the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph. And we'll see that theme raised here will be a theme much later when the apostles and others go out into the world, and the Judaioi, otherwise known as Jews or Judeans, are jealous of them. And so we'll see how what we're seeing is the struggle throughout Acts is in the family. It's not between a group called Jews and a group called Gentiles, or between a group called Jews and a group called Christians. It's an argument amongst the people of Israel, and we'll see later that Israel, we'll see today even, and we've already seen that Israel is the proper name, whereas Judaioi is the name for the opponents, those associated with Judea wherever they are. And we saw them only mentioned briefly in chapter 2, and we won't really see them again till chapter 9. But Judaioi in Acts is 79 times, more even than John's Gospel, where it's 71 times, almost half of all the uses in the New Testament. So it's important, but we aren't on that now. The highlight here being that this is a struggle within Israel. And we see it again today with Moses, because we first saw last time the story of his being born and being brought up as an Egyptian, only spending 3 months, according to Stephen's story, raised in his own household, described as in his father's house, and now for 40 years raised by Pharaoh's daughter as an Egyptian. And now those 40 years are fulfilled, different than what we see in the Norse on the left when he was 40 years old. The emphasis in the Greek here is not on his age, but the amount of time that had passed, and we see that again. And so we'll do this paragraph now. And you see that the key phrase, not a key word as such, that's a two-word phrase, is being treated unjustly, brothers being treated unjustly, and what to do about that. And plainly that's parallel to Jesus' mission, coming into the land and seeing injustice, often by the elite against the poor. It's certainly not Romans who are causing problems that Jesus is curing in the situation. It's within the family. The Romans are always in the background in Luke Acts because the Sanhedrin only have power because the Romans, the occupiers, of course, have given it. But the immediate struggle is not with the Romans. The immediate struggle is here with the family, as we see in the Moses paragraph. And then next time we'll look at the burning bush and the question of his being sent out as a leader. So with that in mind, let's just note briefly that we saw previously Moses in Acts apart from the speech. We saw in chapter 6 the point that the opponents here, the members of the synagogue of the freedmen, falsely claim, or falsely have other people claim, we've heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses. And so clearly the point is that, as we saw in the Pentecost speech, they're proclaiming a Jesus who's a prophet like Moses. But we'll see today, like Moses in some ways, but not in all ways. And that'll be important as we see. So let's just jump right into our verse. So I'll put the key words and shape back up here. When 40 years were fulfilled, and notice the use of the word fulfilled, a key biblical word for a fixed unit of time, it came into his heart. And if you're not familiar with the notion, heart in the biblical idiom is the place of decision or discernment. It's not the place of emotions that is in our cultural context, but the place of decision making. As in Exodus, when it says Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, it didn't mean he made him emotionally distant. It means it made him resolute, that the decision he'd made, God reinforced. That's what it meant to have a hard heart, not to be unfeeling. So idioms don't always translate exactly the same across languages and cultures. As you can see from my note below, the question of the heart is 4 times. The first 2 are about discernment, and the last 2 at the end are hard ones, a hard, uncircumcised of heart, and sawn through the heart, at Stephen's words, as we'll see. So different levels of heart discernment. He went to visit his relatives, which sounds like he's just going out for a visit. And there are several things about that. In the Exodus context, and even in Stephen's speech, we have to wonder, how does he know that the Israelites are his family, since he's only said to have spent his small infancy in his own family's house. And as far as we know, he has no relationship with his mother or sister, who are key characters in the book of Exodus, but they're not mentioned here at all. So in the story that Stephen's telling in Acts 7, as opposed to the story in Exodus, we have no way to know how Moses knows it's his family, or why he's choosing to do that, or what he's been doing for the 40 years besides being educated in the wisdom of Egypt. But the word to visit here, episkepsosthai here, is from the same word that we see back in Luke 1:68 and 78 about the visitation or oversight. And you can see it's related to the noun episkopos for an overseer, but someone who visits a community to determine what's going on. So in that sense, Moses took it in his heart to visit his, in this case, brothers, not relatives, but brothers, as I translated over here. And so did Jesus. It's exactly what Jesus did. He came down. He was the one sent by God to visit his family, the Israelites. And that's key here. Notice as my note below has Exodus, there has Hebrews, because that's some of the perspective there of who these people are from the Egyptian perspective, Hebrews as crossers. But Stephen doesn't mention that anywhere in his speech, but uses the proper term, Israelites. And that's the term all along. So Moses visiting the Israelites is certainly parallel to Jesus visiting the Israelites, and this is what he sees, as we see here. And as my note below has, omitting Moses' guilty behavior of looking around and burying the body. We don't see any of that here. When he saw one of them being wronged, and we don't know what the wrong is, it doesn't say what it is, and it doesn't say who it was done by. That's not the point. The point is just the concept, as we can see in the pink, being treated unjustly. Presumably, we know, although it's not named here, that everybody listening to this, the Sanhedrin certainly knows, that what the Israelites are doing is working hard in the hot sun for the Egyptians, using their own brick-making skills, and then building storage cities for Pharaoh. So it's certainly hard labor, but nothing is specifically said about what the injustice is. Moses' immediate response that came into his heart is to come to his defense. Literally, that's the meaning of the term here, aminatu, only here in the entire Bible. The man described here as oppressed, but literally worn down by work. Keener's translation. It's only one other time in the New Testament, and only in an obscure passage in 3rd Maccabees in the Septuagint, which is an obscure late book. So one of the questions we'd have to ask here is, who is it here that's worn down by work? Not in Luke's gospel, but in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary, and my burden is light, and my yoke is easy." But we don't know that saying in Luke. Certainly people would be oppressed in the Roman Empire, and certainly anybody who were the day laborers around, and we heard plenty of stories about day laborers, would know what being worn down by work is. But we don't hear any other specifics. The audience has to decide that for themselves. But here's where he diverges from Moses, where Moses diverges from Jesus, or I should say Jesus diverges from Moses, given that Moses came first. Jesus is plainly not about violent vengeance here, and that's the phrase here, he made vengeance by striking down the Egyptian. The made vengeance, as you can see here, is not in Exodus. It simply says he struck down the Egyptian. And that's when we find out who the oppressor was. It's not surprising, but we hadn't noted. The word patasso here is in this verse, and then we see it 2 more times. And that's my note below, noting the parallel with Jesus fails here. Jesus will not respond with violence. But here it certainly is parallel again, adding an explanation more fitting of Jesus, as my note says, than Moses. He supposed here, using the verb namazo, which we see a number of times, and it means that basically, that his kinfolk, it's brothers again. Why the New RSV calls them relatives here and kinsfolk here when it's brothers, you'd have to ask them, and well, you can't ask them. But he supposed it is brothers, and that's the point, that they are his brothers. Yes, it's a male term, but Stephen is speaking to the male Sanhedrin, and he referred to them at the beginning in 3 male terms as men, fathers, brothers. So whether we think of this as Luke's patriarchal language or Stephen's patriarchal language, or Stephen playing into the patriarchal presuppositions of the Sanhedrin, we can't decide for sure. But it is brothers in both these places, and it highlights, apart from the patriarchal element, the family element, that he sees these people as his family. So he supposed that his brothers would understand Suniemi here, and only at the very end of Acts, elsewhere in Acts. We saw it a number of times in Luke, and it's all negative except the last one in 24:45 on the road to Emmaus. And that's why understanding might not be the right word, since it's almost always used negatively. It's something like they're confused. They have thoughts that they can't sort out. But what Stephen's telling us that Moses' thought is that his brothers would understand that he was, through his hand here, was giving them salvation. And that's the key element. The phrase here, didosin soterion, here is literally to give salvation. but they did not understand. And note, it doesn't suggest he tried to explain it to them. So much of Acts is about Stephen in this case, and Peter earlier, and Paul, as we'll see a number of times, trying to explain to people what's going on and why they do what they do. But in this recitation, Moses does not try to explain to his brothers that he was trying to rescue them. We just simply get the summary. And then we get the next day. And he said he came to some of them as they were quarreling. Literally, he appeared. And that kind of appearance is suggesting like a vision sort of appearance, a divine appearance. As Keener notes, this unusual wording, Luke again hints of a comparison with Christ in the sense that Jesus could appear that way. Certainly the risen Christ could. There's no sense of Moses being risen here. But it's a sense of he seems to appear out of nowhere while they're quarreling. The word for quarreling here, makamenos, here is only here in Luke Acts, only one time in John, and only in a couple of other letters. As my note has, is presumably the members of the synagogue of freedmen are, given that only some challenge Stephen. But it might even be that the Sanhedrin is represented here. We already saw Gamaliel appealing to them. We didn't see him arguing with them, but we saw him appealing to them, and we'll see an argument amongst them way later when Paul is on trial. And we certainly know there are differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees that have often led to much argument, and there's certainly no lack of argument amongst the Israelite elites, whether orally or in writing, although we don't have much of the writing from this time period, much later from the rabbinical writings. So he finds them quarreling, and he tried to reconcile them into peace. Why the new RSV lives off the eis arenin into peace, I have no idea. The word for try to reconcile, synolasin, is also only here in the Bible. Luke Johnson notes that the portrayal of Moses, quote, as a sage, one of whose works is to make peace, as also with Jesus. Perhaps that makes him like a sage, but a sage isn't usually someone who starts off by striking the opponent. So perhaps John is over-reading that just because someone's trying to make peace does not necessarily make them a sage, because was trying to do it with violence. We don't know how he's trying to do it here. He simply asks them this question. Is that all he's going to do, is ask them, why are you doing this? They're not interested in the conversation. So now we hear brothers for the third time here. You see brothers 3 times. Men, you are brothers. Why do you treat each other unjustly? And you hear how, if you were to read this out loud, you hear how that phrase just echoes and makes it the key theme here. Notice the issue of each other. Literally, why are you beating your neighbor here? And adikete here is the word for treat unjustly, but each other is added here. As Johnson notes, the question has a deeper edge within Luke Acts as a whole. Like the brothers of Joseph who out of envy sought to kill him, and like these contentious Israelites, so do the hearers of Stephen reject Jesus and the apostles and the one speaking to them doing injustice. Basically saying what I've been saying about this paragraph. So now we hear the response here from Exodus 2:14. But the man who was wronging his neighbor, and neighbor for the first time here, otherwise it was brother, and now we hear it as neighbor, pushed Moses aside. Aposato here, and we'll see it again in verse 39 and one other. Keener suggests repudiated. Johnson adds the verb is used frequently by the Septuagint for God's rejection of others, as you see here, of various characters. And so they rejected Moses, of course, like Jesus was rejected, and like Stephen's being rejected. With this question, another rhetorical question, and they ask 2 rhetorical questions, neither of which are answered. Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Or literally, who appointed you? Katastasin here for appointed, and we'll see it another time in 735, echoing Joseph being appointed by Pharaoh in 710, and of course, Jesus being appointed or anointed by God to be Messiah, Son of God, human one, whichever title you like. Here the titles are ruler and judge, and we saw ruler a couple times earlier, and we'll see it again in the speech and several other times. Jesus is never quite called a ruler. He certainly acts as a judge, but one of the key echoes here that Stephen doesn't explicitly go to is Lot speaking to the Sodomites, as we had here, when he tries to appeal to them on behalf of the hospitality of the visitors, but they replied, stand back. And they said, this fellow came here as an alien, or as a resident alien, a gur in Hebrew, and he would play the judge. And so similarly here, we see after this, Moses will go to Midian and be a resident alien. In Greek, parikos, but in a very similar context. So this is after the fact. He's not a resident alien who becomes a judge. He's a judge who then leaves to become a resident alien. But in many ways, we could say he was a resident alien. After all, he wasn't an Egyptian by birth. He was an Israelite by birth. Do they know that? It's hard to know. He's been an Egyptian since he was 3 months old, and they probably don't know his childhood. And we don't know what role he has or who they think he is. They just think that he's someone who would claim to be a ruler and a judge, even though that didn't come out of his mouth. And then they ask this, do you want to kill me? Or this individual now asks this, do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And in Exodus, that's what leads Moses to realize he was seen burying the Egyptian in the sand and runs. But we don't hear anything in Stephen's speech about burying the Egyptian in the sand. This is an exact quote from Exodus 2:14. It's interesting because most of the rest of this is a little bit paraphrased. When he heard this, Moses fled. The Septuagint had withdrew, but this is a fugen, which is literally to flee, and became a parakos, as Abraham was in Mesopotamia back in 7:6. Here in the land of Midian, Walton there notes below its location on the eastern coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, which you can see here. It's a curious thing in the story, in Exodus and here, that Moses is up here somewhere in Egypt. We don't know exactly where. No cities are named. And to get away, he goes all the way down the Sinai Peninsula, presumably across on the purple line here, because you can't get there from here without going all the way around. How would he know any path? Did he go completely by himself? What a dangerous journey that would be, to go completely alone. How long would that take? None of that is named, and it's just taken for granted both here and in Exodus that you just, well, sure, let's just trip on over to Midian. But as you can see from the Google Maps image here, and it's not that different than the biblical atlas, it's a dry desert place. It's not the most habitable place. And according to Exodus, he becomes a shepherd there for his father-in-law Jethro. But we don't hear anything about that here. All we hear there is, there he became the father of 2 sons. But literally it's where, not there. So highlighting the foreignness. And saying he became the father of 2 sons there certainly matches Joseph. Walton suggests it's to note the children of a foreign woman, although the mother is not named, and maybe. But that's not really the theme here so much. The theme is not challenging the Ezra-Nehemiah post-exilic theme of you can't marry foreigners. We've looked at the question of the land, and the question of the land, as we'll see, is going to culminate around the temple and where God is, and that God isn't only in the temple, and therefore the people that Stephen's a part of, the 7, can have an alternative banking arrangement. That's the serving at tables that we looked at in chapter 6, that challenges the synagogue of the freedmen's apparent relationship with the people of the temple to perform banking services. So that's the key theme. The key theme is not intermarriage or ethnicity across generations, but so that's mentioned there, and we don't otherwise know why. So we'll stop there now, and we'll continue with the next 40 years fulfilled as Moses finds himself at a burning bush, and a great appearance happens there. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.